Your title is usually the first impression fantasy readers have of your story. So if your title sucks, readers might forget about your book without a second thought. But if your title is great, your book will stand out from the crowd and it will make readers desperate to know more. After publishing 4 books and working with hundreds of writers in my programs, I've discovered 5 principles that consistently lead to great titles. Today, I'll be covering these principles, and then at the end of the video, I have several titles from members of my Fantasy Writers Guild, and I'll be rating these titles and providing suggestions for improvement so that you can see these principles in action. To explain the first title principle, which I think is unreasonably effective, almost like a cheat code, take a look at these examples I'm about to show you and see if you can identify what they have in common. First, we have Orconomics. Then we have Blackstone Heart, The Gutter Prayer, Priest of Lies, The Library of the Unwritten, The Bone Ships, Prince of Thorns, Legends and Lattes, and lastly, Empire of Silence. So I think all these titles are great. They make me really curious to know what these stories are about. But what is it that they all have in common, and why is this so effective at building intrigue with a potential reader? Here's the answer. All of these titles use contradiction, which is our first principle for writing great fantasy titles. The reason why this is so effective is because if you can find a way to build contradiction into your title, it creates this open loop in a potential reader's mind and it makes them curious to know more. For instance, Orconomics combines the idea of orcs, who are these, brutish, thuggish, quite unthinking fantasy creatures in most of the stories we read, and it combines it with economics. That's a clash. We want to know, how are these two things fitting together? And so that contradiction creates a lot of curiosity and intrigue. Likewise, Blackstone Heart takes the idea of a heart, which is something that's, soft and warm and fleshy and organic, and then it mashes it up with black stone, which is the exact opposite. It's cold, it's hard, it's unfeeling. It's a clear contradiction. The Gutter Prayer takes the idea of prayer, which is, something lofty and spiritual and clean and of the heavens, and then it mashes it up with gutter, which is something that is low, dirty, urban, very human in a way. Priest of Lies does the exact same thing. It takes priests, which are supposed to be, morality, goodness, honor, spirituality, all of that, and then it takes lies, which is the exact opposite of that particular idea. And I could go on with the other titles I have up on my screen here, but you can probably see how they're all using this principle of contradiction. And I'm willing to bet that over the next few weeks, you're going to see this principle absolutely everywhere, with the book titles you're seeing and the movie titles you're seeing, because so many great titles all use contradiction as a way to hook you. And I think one of the big reasons why contradiction is so effective is because if you have contradiction in your title, it sort of guarantees that your title idea is surprising and fresh. For instance, if we look at Blackstone Heart, imagine if that title was Blackstone Killer or Blackstone Demon. It wouldn't really be surprising, right? Because all of those ideas, they sort of feel like they fit together. But Blackstone Heart, it feels like you're surprising us. There's this twist mid-sentence. Now, of course, contradiction is just one of the 5 principles to keep in mind when you're developing your fantasy title. The second key titling principle is actually a very common mistake, which I want you to avoid because I see far too many titles have this issue, and it really leads to a massive wasted opportunity and often really confuses readers in a bad way. And so this second titling principle is to avoid insider information. In other words, you want to avoid titles that only make sense once you have finished reading the book. Because fundamentally, if you think about it, the goal of a title is to attract potential readers who haven't yet read your book. And the goal is that your title is intriguing enough that it makes them read the blurb, perhaps read a couple of the opening pages, and then eventually buy your book and read the whole thing and love it. And to give an example of what I mean here, if we consider something like Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, I really love this story. I think it is an excellent book. But the title doesn't really make sense until you've read the book. It's called Ninth House, and that only makes sense once you know that inside this book, there are 8 secret magical societies of Yale, and then the main character is part of the Ninth House that oversees these other 8 houses. But if you haven't read the book, you don't understand the meaning of the title. So if you're a potential reader and you haven't gone through this yet, the title is meaningless to you. And it's not to say that the title is necessarily bad, but the problem with these type of titles that rely on insider information, as I call it, is that you've wasted a potential opportunity to hook a possible future reader. This is why it is usually a bad idea to title your fantasy novel after a character. So for instance, if you look at Carrie by Stephen King, or Billy Summers by Stephen King. Without having read those stories, I have zero connection to those names. They're meaningless to me. And so they do nothing to hook me as a potential reader. Now, obviously, Stephen King is massive, so his titles don't really matter from a marketing perspective. People are going to read his books regardless. And in fairness to him, he does have some really great titles. I really like Under the Dome as a title, and 11/22/63 is a really good title as well, because that's the date of JFK's assassination, which is what the book is all about. But my key point here is that if you don't have a massive name like Stephen King, you don't have the luxury of mailing in a title by just naming it after a character from your book. So try really hard to avoid using insider information when you're titling your fantasy novel. If you are going to use a character name, it is usually better to describe them based on their role rather than using their actual name. For instance, The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison is a way better title than Maya Drazar, which is the name of the main character in this story. And honestly, I'm not even sure if I was pronouncing his name correctly. And then the flip side of this, a bad example I would say, is if you look at something like Eragon, which is a book I quite enjoy actually, and really got me into fantasy when I was younger, that name of Eragon is meaningless to us without having actually read the story. Something like The Last Dragon Rider would probably have done a better job of describing what this story is actually about, and it would have given a potential hook in the title that currently isn't there. Oh, and a fun sidebar Easter egg with this as well. I only recently discovered that Eragon is literally just dragon, but he took the D and he went to the next letter in the alphabet. So little fun Easter egg for you there. Now you're probably wondering, okay, Jed, are there any exceptions to this rule of never use insider information in your title? And the answer, of course, is yes. As with every, so-called rule in writing, there's always exceptions that actually succeed despite the fact that they're going against, recommended guidelines or whatever. And I think a good example of this is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Mistborn is a name that is meaningless to us without having read the story. Obviously, if you read this book, you know that a Mistborn is a type of person with particular magical abilities. But if you're a stranger to this book, you don't actually know what that means. However, I would say it still functions as quite a good title. And the reason for that is that it is a cool enough name by itself that it creates the right level of intrigue and curiosity. And, this particular cover doesn't show it, but the subtitle of this book is Mistborn: The Final Empire, which adds a little bit more of a hook to the title as well. Now, the reason why Mistborn is working well as a title here, even though it kind of goes against this rule of not using insider information, is partly because it's actually using our first title principle of contradiction, right? Like, what does it mean to be born to the mist? That seems like this weird contradictory thing that can't take place. So we want to know what that's about. And then the use of the word mist as well, there's something about that that feels kind of evocative and mysterious, and, it feels intriguing in its own right. And then, of course, we have the final empire part, which, builds an additional layer of contradiction into things, because how can an empire be final? Or, to give another example here, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Percy Jackson as a name, it's meaningless to you if you haven't read the story, right? So it's kind of failing in that regard. However, and the Lightning Thief, that is doing all the heavy lifting in this title here. And that's because Lightning Thief is carrying, an interesting contradiction in itself. Yet again, how can you steal lightning? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And it immediately suggests at some kind of conflict and kind of gives us hints as to what the plot of this story would be about. Now, the third principle for writing a great fantasy title is incredibly important to get right. And the reason for that is that along with trying to intrigue your readers, your title has a very crucial role of setting up your readers' expectations for what type of story they're going to experience. And that's why our third title principle is to suggest at the journey and tone that readers are going to experience inside your story. So the key idea here is that your title really plays a crucial role in establishing your readers' expectations for what type of story they're going to read. And as a result, it's really important that you set up the right kind of promises with your title. For instance, if you're writing a fantasy novel that's pretty dark and gritty and there's tons of violence and, it's this grimdark thing, you probably don't want to call it the Fluffy Sunshine Flower Regiment, right? Like, that's going to set the wrong expectations for what type of story the reader is going to experience. So to explain this principle in action, let's look at some more good titles, and I'll explain how they're effective at building the right reader expectations. So first of all, we have The Lies of Locke Lamora. Just putting the word lies in there, it clearly shows us that this is going to be a story about deception, trickery, and there's probably going to be a lot of twists involved as well. The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This has quite a sort of, glorious, exalted tone to it, right? The Way of Kings. This is probably going to be a story about the importance of honor, and morality is going to play a big role. It has quite a grand sort of epic scale to it as well. Likewise, She Who Became the Sun. It suggests that we're going to have a character who sort of ascends to become a legendary or mythical figure. The Poppy War. Right away, having war in the title tells me that there's going to be some kind of big conflict here. And then the inclusion of the word poppy, immediately makes you think of like, okay, opium, the drug trade. Maybe the war is going to be over some kind of, drug substance. Jade City. City here implies obviously some kind of urban setting, probably modern levels of technology. And then Jade has this sort of Eastern sort of Asian vibe to it as well. So maybe it's going to take place in a city that's sort of inspired by, Chinese culture or something like that. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay, right away we have a very whimsical tone, It's using a lot of contradiction, right? The Hitchhiker's Guide, you're immediately thinking of, okay, Hitchhiker's Guide to traveling around Europe or traveling around South America or something like that. But then to the galaxy, you're going, oh, wow, okay, that's that's really strange. I want to know more about that. I think this is a really, really good title for establishing the sort of absurdist tone of this story. And if you've read it, it's really well fitting to the actual experience of the book. Next, we have Red Rising. So what do you think about when you hear Red Rising? You think about revolution. Red kind of conjures up ideas of blood. The idea of red and rising, it sort of feels like there's going to be some kind of socialist, political upheaval or something like that. There's probably going to be characters who are overthrowing some kind of system here. Next example, Last Argument of Kings. Okay, there's a sense here of desperation, of conflict. Obviously, the sort of epic scale of kings, warring with each other here. There's going to be lots of conflicts. There's going to be lots of battles. And a little sidebar here, something that Joe Abercrombie does with his book titles, which I find pretty interesting, is that he often takes them as quotations from different historical works. So The Blade itself is a quote from the Odyssey by Homer. And that quote goes something like, "The blade itself incites deeds of violence." The next book in this series is Before They Are Hanged. And that's a quote from Heinrich Heine, I think, which says, "We should forgive our enemies, but not before they are hanged." And then Last Argument of Kings is an inscription that I think it was King Louis XIV had carved on his cannons, right? So he's like, these cannons are the last argument I have as a king. Next example, A Game of Thrones, immediately suggesting, political machinations and scheming and betrayal, and tells you right away what everyone is fighting over. Everyone is fighting over control of this throne. To give some examples from my own books here, Across the Broken Stars. Across is kind of implying this idea of a quest, some kind of journey, trying to reach a destination. Stars is giving you this idea that it's maybe going to take place in space. There's going to be sort of cosmological aspects to the story. And then Broken implies that there's something wrong with the world, or perhaps with the characters who are existing in that world. Another example from my own writing, The Thunder Heist. Right away, it tells you this story is going to be about a heist. There's going to be something that characters are trying to steal. Now, hopefully you can see here with all of these examples I've just given you, how they all convey really clear expectations around the tone, the subject matter, and the type of story that you're going to experience. Needless to say, it's really important that your story actually delivers on the promise of your title. So for instance, with The Thunder Heist, if no one tried to pull off a heist in that book, you'd be pretty disappointed. Now, along with using your title to set up the right expectations in terms of the journey and tone of your story, it's also really important to consider the fourth title principle, which is somewhat related to this. And that principle is to identify the genre of your story. Again, your title plays a really major marketing function, especially if you don't have a massive author platform yet. It's usually really wise to use your title to identify elements of your story that your ideal reader will resonate with. So for instance, if a major focus of your story is vampires, then you probably should put vampires in the title, like Empire the Vampire by J. Christoph. If your protagonist is an assassin, then you probably want to mention that in the title, like Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is why I called one of my books Kingdom of Dragons. And yes, you can absolutely say that's a cliched title or whatever, but it does clearly identify that this is a fantasy novel and it has dragons in it. And it probably also suggests that the story is somewhat epic in scale because of the inclusion of that word kingdom. And so if you're a reader that likes dragons, this title is probably going to be more effective at getting you to take a look at the blurb and maybe read a couple of the first few pages and hopefully buy the book. As opposed to if I just used some very, poetic, unique title that didn't really clearly communicate one of the main elements of this story. Now, of course, this isn't me saying Kingdom of Dragons is a perfect title. I would actually say that out of the 4 books I've published, it's probably my least favorite title. And part of the problem there is that I initially used it as a placeholder when I was writing this book, but then I found myself just mentioning it in quite a few videos. And when it came time to launch this on Kickstarter, I'd sort of already built up a bit of awareness, quite a bit of awareness actually, around this title, just in my YouTube videos and emails and everything. And so I felt reluctant to change the title and confuse my readers. Not sure if I would really do the same this time. I think with the next book I publish, I'm going to be very cautious about becoming overly attached to a placeholder title. So lesson learned. Now, when you are using an element in your title that lots of people are familiar with, whether it's vampires or assassins or dragons, the way to actually elevate your title and take it to the next level here so that it can be even more effective is to remember to apply our first title principle we discussed back at the start of this video, which is contradiction. In other words, give readers something familiar, but also give them something strange at the same time. And again, critiquing myself here, this is something I probably didn't do with Kingdom of Dragons. Kingdom and dragons, they sort of feel like they go together. But to give you an example of what I mean here, consider these two titles, and then you tell me which one resonates with you more. On one hand, we have the blue dragon, and then on the other hand, we have the accidental dragon. You're way more intrigued by the accidental dragon, right? Because it doesn't feel obvious. It feels surprising. There's a contradiction there. It immediately raises a question in your mind, which is, wait, how can you accidentally become a dragon? Now, there's one last key principle here that I want to cover when it comes to writing really good fantasy titles. And once we've covered this, I'll be pulling up the titles from members of my guild and I'll be going through and critiquing those. But first, the fifth title principle is that your title is pleasing to say and easy to spell. This is insanely important. Imagine someone hears your title spoken on a podcast or it's suggested to them by a friend. If they pull up their phone and they try to type the title in, are they going to be able to accurately spell the title and get the right result? This sounds kind of simple, but it blows my mind the number of times this isn't done with titles. And that's a massive mistake because you could have just lost a potential reader right there and then. This is something where Brandon Sanderson has mentioned this with Elantris, which is his first published book. He has this quote on a blog post where he said, "This title isn't without its problems. People have trouble spelling it when I say the title, and some think of the car named the Elantra. At one panel, I even had one person mishear me, thinking the name of the book was The Laundress," which is, quite a different book. And to call myself out here as well, if you look at Siege of Trebelin, which is the interactive fantasy novel I wrote that was published by Choice of Games a few years ago, I don't think it's the greatest title I could have come up with because Trebelin as a word, it's very hard to spell if you're just hearing it. And if you're just reading it, it's really hard for people to pronounce the same way. The one good aspect of this title is, okay, it tells you we're dealing with a siege, which is what the story is all about. But Trebelin, I don't know if it was the strongest option. So if I had my time again with this, I would probably change the title. And by the way, I actually have an 80-minute video on this YouTube channel where I break down the full process behind writing Siege of Trebelin, all the way through from pitching the publisher to get my publishing contract, to planning the story, writing the story, editing it, launching it, marketing it, basically everything start to finish, showing you behind the scenes of what it's like to write an interactive fantasy novel that has now made over $60,000 in total sales. So I'll link that in the description down below if you want to check that out. So the key point here is that ideally you want a title that is really easy for potential readers to spell out when they hear it. But the other element of this principle as well is that you want your titles to feel pleasing when readers hear it. Because if your title is pleasing to say, it makes it more memorable. And again, that just increases the chance of your reader becoming enthralled by your story. I think a great example of this is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I remember hearing that title mentioned years before I got around to actually reading the book. And there's something just so kind of poetic and evocative and mysterious about that name that it got me really intrigued to know what the story is about. And as a sidebar, I wonder if Patrick Rothfuss with this title was inspired by The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which uses a similar construction. The other thing that can make your titles sound a bit more pleasing when they're spoken aloud is alliteration. So for instance, if we look at the examples on this page, they all use alliteration as a way to kind of make the name echo in your mind, and it just makes it feel a little bit more memorable. So you've got Red Rising, The Lies of Loch Lamora, Red Seas Under Red Skies, Legends and Lattes, The Sword in the Stone, Children of Blood and Bone, Mr. Monday, Spinning Silver, Peter Pan. Alliteration can be a really useful tool just to get that extra little bit of sort of impact when it comes to your title. Okay, now that we've covered our 5 principles for writing great fantasy titles, let's look at some titles from my guild members. I'm going to be rating each of these as either above average, acceptable, or needs work, and I'll also be providing suggestions for improvement or tweaks as we go through this. And before we get into this, I just want to thank all of the members of my guild who bravely sent your titles in for my critique. Okay, our first title is She Who Keeps the Sky. Keep in mind with all these titles, for some of these stories, I know some details about it because they're members of my guild, but I'm going to try to assess these titles like a stranger who doesn't really have any knowledge of what the stories are. I did also get some members to send in some additional information about their stories, just in case I need it to tweak or improve these titles. But for the most part, I'm just going to try to judge these based on what I'm seeing right here. I really like this. This has a very poetic tone to it. She who keeps the sky. There's a good contradiction built into this. Like, how does one keep the sky? That doesn't kind of make sense to me. And so it's interesting as a result. It's a very cool construction. You know, you're not starting the title with the, which there's nothing wrong with starting your title with the, but I often find that when you start your title with something that isn't an a or a the, it becomes usually more unique. So she who keeps the sky, it reminds me a little bit of she who became the sun, but you know, it's doing its own thing. I really like this. I think I'm going to rate this one as above average. It really stands out quite nicely to me. Okay, our next title is The Celestials. Straight away, it's feeling a little bit too simplistic to me. There's not really enough for me to grab onto. And while I like Celestials as, you know, a kind of evocative name, it doesn't really give me like that much curiosity as it currently stands. So I would probably say that this to me is something that needs work. And one way that could improve this is just by adding some more contradiction or more elements into it. So I know a little bit about this story based on the description I saw the writer send through to me in the guild. And one of the ideas, without spoiling too much about the story, is that it's kind of about these immortal characters who become mortal or something along that line. And so even adding something like the Mortal Celestials would be an immediate improvement in my mind, because it just adds in that contradiction. Like, mortal and celestials, they don't feel like they pair together. And so that's probably one of the ways that I would, you know, maybe tweak this a little bit. But even if that's not the right title for this, not the right extra word to add in, I think there does need to be something else added in here just to give us a bit more intrigue. Okay, next we have The Wake of the Wind Rose North. This has a really great sound. The alliteration of Wake of the Wind Rose North is really good. I don't know what the Wind Rose North is. Like, I do know what it is because I saw the writer's description of it, and she told me that it is a ship. So that is kind of making sense once you know that information. But again, like, the reader doesn't know that information necessarily. Is it an issue? Possibly not. Like, it's a word that's, yes, it's a made up word. This idea of windrose is a made up word that doesn't have any meaning to us necessarily, but it sort of sounds cool within this title. And it implies, you know, adventure, maybe some kind of journey, maybe, you know, following in the wake of this thing. So I'm probably going to give this one an acceptable. Next title, The Dragon and the Dead Man. So I'm smiling because I know quite a bit about this story. I'm going to try to keep it out of my mind as much as possible when I assess this title. But I did see this title for the first time from the writer in question, I think almost 2 years ago at this stage, which is kind of crazy to think about. So hopefully this book is ready for publication soon. I really like this title. You know, even putting aside my biases towards it and everything, I think that you've got the power word of dragon. So obviously there's that element that is familiar, that is drawing us in. The dead man, it's not necessarily like a new unexpected element, but it is something that is contrasting nicely with the dragon. And in the middle, it's kind of implying there's going to be maybe some sort of relationship here. And the whole sort of alliterative nature of this works really well. The dragon and the dead man. It's very memorable. I feel like it's just a cool phrase, and it's not a particular construction I've sort of seen before. So I'm going to give this one an above average. I think it's very memorable. Yeah, like I said, I remember seeing it for the first time like 2 years ago, and it really stuck with me in my head. So yeah, I think this is a really effective title. I'm going to give that one an above average ranking. Okay, our next title is Starshard Saga, the Book of Alec. Things I really like about this, Starshard is a very cool name. In terms of the sound of this, I actually find Starshard Saga to be a bit of a hard thing to pronounce out loud. It's maybe an instance of going a little bit overboard with the alliteration. Starshard Saga, it's sort of something that is almost a bit of a tongue twister in some ways. Then the inclusion of the Book of Alec, you know, to me that doesn't really like fit with this in a way. Like, saga, okay, this is perhaps some kind of series, but I'm not really sure if like the series is the Book of Alec or if Starshard Saga is the thing. And Alec as a name, it feels kind of like, no offense to any Alecs out there that are watching, but it feels kind of like mundane in a way that doesn't work with this. You know, the only other title I'm thinking that kind of matches this is something like Dungeon Crawler Carl, right? Which is a really cool title. Where it has like a very sort of normal name intersposed against a very extraordinary situation of dungeon crawling. But for me, like, I actually think this would be a lot stronger. And again, like, I don't really know the context behind everything this author is trying to achieve with this, but to me, Starshard, Like, that's really cool, that element there. And then everything else around it, like, I'm not entirely sold by it in the same way. So with this one, I would just say it needs a bit of work, just because of that confusing aspect I mentioned. Our next title, The Enigma of Souls. I quite like this one. You know, there's a sense of mystery to it, like enigma. It's probably going to deal with some question of, you know, maybe the afterlife, souls, some spiritual aspects of it, perhaps, or some magical aspects. It's really cool. One thing I'm almost wondering here is going, you know, full Justin Timberlake on this and saying drop the. It maybe sounds a little bit cleaner if you just say Enigma of Souls. Yeah, I think that's one where, you know, if you're the one that's written this and you're watching this video, like, that's something where I would just play with, like, do I need the there, or can I drop it and make it a little bit shorter, a little bit punchier, and make it just start in a bit more of a distinctive way? Enigma of Souls, rather than the Enigma of Souls. Again, that's kind of just like a personal preference thing, but maybe Enigma of Souls to me is a little bit stronger. Either way though, even with the at the start, I would probably say that this one is above average. Now, coming up with a great title for your story is just one aspect of writing an amazing fantasy novel. Check out this video over here if you want to know how to come up with better story ideas so that you can captivate readers and get them hooked and interested in reading your book.